Imagine you are sitting in a movie theater in the summer of 1977. The lights go down. A trumpet blast fills the room so loud it practically punches you in the chest. Then, words start scrolling up a giant screen against a backdrop of stars. And within the next 2 hours, your entire understanding of what a movie could be gets completely rewritten. That was what it felt like on May 25, 1977, the day Star Wars opened in theaters across the United States. But here is the thing most people forget: almost nobody believed that movie would work. Not the studio executives. Not the theater owners. Not even some of the people who made it. What happened behind the scenes was not the polished story of a genius filmmaker executing his perfect vision. It was a cascade of disasters, arguments, accidents, questionable decisions, and moments of near-total collapse that somehow produced one of the greatest films ever made. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on all of it. These are 15 insane facts about Star Wars 1977 that most fans have never heard, and some of them will completely change how you see that movie the next time you watch it. Stay with me all the way to number 1, because the final fact is probably the most surprising of all. Let's get into it. Let's start with the man who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wise, mysterious mentor figure who guides Luke Skywalker onto his path as a Jedi. Sir Alec Guinness was a decorated British actor when George Lucas's script arrived in front of him. He had an Academy Award on his shelf. He had received a knighthood from the Queen of England. He was, without question, one of the most respected performers in the world at that time. And when he sat down to read the Star Wars script, his reaction was not excitement. It was closer to mild embarrassment. Guinness wrote to a close friend describing the whole thing as science fiction nonsense, fairy tale rubbish, essentially. He thought the dialogue was clunky, the story was silly, and the whole enterprise felt beneath a man of his standing. Here is how little he thought of the project: he could not even be bothered to remember the director's name correctly. In early conversations and correspondence, Guinness referred to George Lucas as Paul Lucas. Not a typo. He just genuinely could not be bothered to get it right. Paul or George, what does it matter when you are doing someone a favor? But the money was decent and the schedule worked, so Guinness signed on. Lucas offered him a deal that included a percentage of the gross profits, 2.25% to be specific. Guinness figured the film would quietly disappear after a few weeks in theaters, the percentage would amount to nothing, and he would move on with his career having done something unusual. Meanwhile, Harrison Ford, who played Han Solo, the character that arguably launched the biggest movie star career of that era, worked on the production for 10 weeks and was paid a flat fee of $1,000 per week. That is it. $10,000 total. No profit share. No back-end deal. Just 10 grand for becoming Han Solo. Star Wars went on to earn over $775 million worldwide. Alec Guinness, the man who called it rubbish and got the director's name wrong, collected somewhere north of $50 million over the lifetime of the original trilogy and its re-releases. Harrison Ford, the guy audiences actually fell in love with, walked away with $10,000 and a career. Not a bad trade for Ford personally, but as far as paydays go, it is one of the most lopsided stories in Hollywood history. This is the business blunder of the 20th century, and it happened because some very powerful people made a very reasonable assumption that turned out to be completely wrong. When George Lucas was negotiating his original deal with 20th Century Fox back in 1973, the studio offered him $500,000 to write and direct Star Wars. Lucas came back with a counteroffer. He would accept $150,000, a full $350,000 less than what they were offering, in exchange for two things: the rights to make sequels, and the rights to all merchandise connected to the film. Fox executives could not say yes fast enough. And honestly, from where they stood, it made total sense. Movie merchandise in the early 1970s was not what it is today. Studios had tried selling toys and products tied to films before and mostly lost money doing it. There was no cultural precedent for a movie's plastic action figures turning into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The very idea seemed almost ridiculous. So Fox gave Lucas exactly what he asked for, probably feeling like they had just pulled off a clever negotiation. In the first year after Star Wars opened, the film generated $100 million in merchandise sales alone. Kenner, the toy company that licensed the rights to make Star Wars action figures, had originally invested around $100,000 in the deal. They made that back 1,000 times over in 12 months. And Lucas owned all of it. By the time he sold the entire Star Wars franchise to Disney in 2012 for $4 billion, the merchandise rights were the crown jewel of what he was selling. Across the lifetime of the original trilogy and everything that followed, Star Wars merchandise had generated an estimated $27 billion. Toys alone accounted for roughly $12 billion of that. At the peak, Star Wars products were bringing in $3 billion per year in retail sales. Fox kept the rights to distribute the movies and made enormous amounts of money from that. But Lucas kept the toys, the games, the clothing, the bedsheets, the Halloween costumes, and everything else. He became one of the wealthiest people in the entertainment industry entirely because two executives in the 1970s thought action figures were a passing fad. When you think of Darth Vader, the first thing your brain probably does is replay that deep, resonant voice. The slow breathing. The calm menace. Every single word James Earl Jones ever spoke as that character landing like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Now completely erase that and replace it with a thick West Country British accent, the kind of voice you might hear from someone selling potatoes at an outdoor market in rural England. That was Darth Vader during the actual filming of Star Wars. David Prowse was the man inside the Vader suit. He was a 6'6" bodybuilder from Bristol, England, and his voice carried an accent so regional and so distinctive that the crew began privately referring to him as Darth Farmer. Not because they were being cruel, well, maybe a little, but because when this towering, black-armored villain strode onto the set and delivered his menacing lines about the dark side of the Force, he genuinely sounded like he was asking someone how much they wanted for a bag of turnips. George Lucas recognized immediately that Prowse's voice simply could not stay in the final film. The problem was, nobody told Prowse this directly. He believed throughout the entire shoot that he would have the chance to re-record his lines in post-production with his voice cleaned up and amplified to match the intimidating physicality of the costume. He was wrong. Lucas quietly hired James Earl Jones to completely replace every single word of dialogue. Jones recorded all of Vader's lines in 2.5 hours. For his work, he was paid $7,500 total. He considered the job something closer to a sound effects contribution than an acting role, and he actually declined to take any screen credit for years out of respect for Prowse, who had done the difficult physical work of wearing that suit for months. Prowse found out his voice had been replaced when he watched the finished film in the theater, just like everyone else. He told interviewers years later that he still believed he should have been the voice of Darth Vader. Jones did not receive official on-screen credit until the 1997 special edition re-releases, 20 years after the original film came out. This one stayed hidden for longer than most government secrets. During the 1976 London production of Star Wars, 19-year-old Carrie Fisher and 33-year-old Harrison Ford, who was married with 2 young children at the time, began a romantic relationship that lasted for roughly 3 months. Fisher later described it as both exhilarating and emotionally confusing. She was young, inexperienced in serious relationships, and completely infatuated. Ford was already worldly, charming, and very much spoken for. Fisher spent years privately hoping the relationship meant more to Ford than it seemed to. She imagined a future together. She gave their potential couple name serious thought. She was, by her own description decades later, completely swept away by the whole thing. When filming wrapped up, the romance ended cleanly and completely. Ford returned to his family and his life. Fisher kept the secret and carried her feelings quietly for years that turned into decades. Nobody found out. Not the press. Not their co-stars. Not the public. Through the entire original trilogy, through the prequels era, through countless press appearances and interviews and conventions, both actors maintained the professional friendship they had developed on set. Fisher wrote books, performed stand-up comedy, gave candid interviews about almost every other part of her personal life. But this particular chapter stayed closed. Then in 2016, Fisher published a memoir called The Princess Diarist, which she had partly constructed from journals she kept during filming. And in those journals was everything, every feeling, every moment, every secret she had kept for 4 decades. Ford was reportedly not thrilled. According to Fisher, his advice when he found out the book was coming was essentially to get legal counsel. She hoped he was joking. Fisher, being Fisher, continued doing press interviews about it with her characteristic mix of honesty and dark humor. Ford's representative said nothing officially. The timing made it especially interesting because 2015 had required both actors to do extensive press together for The Force Awakens, promoting a movie while Fisher was privately writing a book that would expose their shared past. Whatever those junket conversations were like backstage, nobody is saying. There is a version of the Star Wars origin story that presents George Lucas as a calm visionary who knew exactly what he was building. The reality is dramatically different. Midway through production, Lucas started noticing that his hair was coming out in clumps. Not the gradual thinning that happens to a lot of people, actual clumps. Around the same time, he began experiencing chest tightness and shortness of breath severe enough that he checked himself into a hospital, convinced at age 32 that he was having a heart attack. The doctors ran their tests and gave him a diagnosis that was almost worse than what he feared, not a heart attack this time, but hypertension and stress so extreme that a real cardiac event was a genuine possibility if he did not change something. His body was staging a full rebellion. The problem was there was nothing to change. The production was behind schedule. The special effects team was struggling. The British crew largely thought the film was beneath them and made little effort to hide it. Several of the lead actors thought the dialogue was undeliverable. Harrison Ford famously told Lucas directly that the lines were things you could type but not actually speak out loud as a human being. The studio was nervous about the budget. And Lucas was sitting at the center of all of it, trying to hold everything together through sheer willpower while his cardiovascular system quietly plotted against him. He went right back to work. Hair kept falling out. Sleep became scarce. The stress did not let up for months. And then the movie came out, and it made hundreds of millions of dollars, and George Lucas became one of the most celebrated filmmakers in the world, and also the Star Wars guy forever, which came with its own particular kind of pressure that never really went away. Decades later, when he made changes to the original films and introduced new characters that fans disliked, he found out that the internet can be more stressful than any film production. On January 11, 1977, for months before Star Wars was scheduled to hit theaters, Mark Hamill was driving on a California freeway when he lost control of his car. He fractured bones in his face, including his nose and cheekbone, and required reconstructive surgery that used cartilage from his own ear. When The Empire Strikes Back came out 3 years later in 1980, the film famously opens with Luke Skywalker being attacked by a vicious ice creature called a wampa, which mauls his face and leaves visible scarring. Luke spends multiple scenes looking roughed up and damaged. Film fans immediately noticed that Hamill's face looked different between the two movies and concluded the wampa scene had been created specifically to explain the real-life injury. George Lucas insisted for years that this was not the case, that the wampa attack was always planned as a dramatic story element and the resemblance to Hamill's actual situation was purely coincidental. Carrie Fisher, who had considerably less reason to be diplomatic about it, directly contradicted Lucas in interviews and suggested the accident absolutely played a role in how that opening was constructed. Hamill himself has been remarkably careful never to fully confirm or deny either version. The honest answer is probably somewhere in between. Hamill's injuries from the accident were real but not as catastrophically disfiguring as tabloids at the time suggested. The tabloid coverage was genuinely wild. Some reports had his nose sliding off his face entirely and described him crawling from flaming wreckage. Hamill later said reading those stories was almost entertaining. But there were visible differences in his face between the two films, and the wampa scene provided a very convenient in-universe explanation for them, whether or not that was the original intention. The Tunisian desert was chosen as the filming location for the planet Tatooine largely because of its dramatic landscape and its reputation for reliable, dry, predictable weather. George Lucas needed a place that looked genuinely alien. Tunisia delivered that, along with several things nobody asked for. On the very first day of shooting, R2-D2's battery system failed almost immediately. The remote-controlled droid that was supposed to zip around the desert with personality and charm instead sat motionless in the sand while the crew scrambled to fix the problem. When they did get R2-D2 moving, the remote control signal kept getting crossed with Arabic radio broadcasts in the area, causing the droid to spin and jerk in random directions and occasionally crash directly into other equipment or crew members. Then the rain came. In a desert location chosen specifically for its dry conditions, it rained for 4 consecutive days, the first significant rainfall the region had seen in roughly 7 years. The set flooded. Equipment sank into mud that appeared from nowhere. The Tunisian army was brought in to help extract vehicles and gear from the muck. Production halted while the crew waited for the desert to return to being a desert. When filming resumed, a sandstorm destroyed the large sand crawler set overnight. The crew rebuilt it in a single day, filmed the scenes they needed, then spent another day burning it down for a later scene in the script. And then came the incident with Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader at the time, spotted the sand crawler near the border between Tunisia and Libya and became convinced it was a military vehicle, possibly a weapon or an invasion staging prop. This was not entirely paranoid given the existing political tensions between the two countries. Libya had recently expelled thousands of Tunisian workers. There were credible accusations flying in both directions about assassination plots at the government level. The two nations were genuinely hostile toward each other. Gaddafi formally accused Tunisia of preparing a military action. Lucas, not wanting to explain to Fox that his science fiction movie had accidentally triggered a North African international incident, moved filming away from the border area immediately. When Fox scheduled Star Wars for release on Memorial Day weekend in 1977, fewer than 40 theaters across the country were willing to show it. Theater owners looked at the film, a space adventure with unknown young actors and a director who had only made one commercially successful film, and decided to pass. They had screens to fill with things audiences actually wanted to see. Fox also had another film releasing around the same time, an adaptation of a popular novel called The Other Side of Midnight, which theater owners genuinely were interested in booking. And here is where Fox executives made a decision that was both brilliantly effective and completely illegal. They told theater owners, in plain terms, that if they wanted to book The Other Side of Midnight, they also had to book Star Wars. Take both or get neither. This practice is called block booking, and it has been explicitly prohibited under United States antitrust law since the 1940s, when the Supreme Court ruled that studios could not use popular films as leverage to force theaters into showing less desirable ones. Fox knew this. They did it anyway. The result was that Star Wars went from 40 willing screens to several hundred. When the film opened and became an immediate, overwhelming cultural phenomenon, theaters found themselves in the strange position of being legally obligated to show The Other Side of Midnight, a film absolutely nobody was coming to see, just to maintain their access to the movie everyone was desperate to watch. The federal government eventually fined Fox $25,000 for the antitrust violation. Fox paid it without apparent distress, because by the time the check cleared, Star Wars had made that amount of money in roughly the time it takes to eat a bag of popcorn. It remains one of the more remarkable cost-benefit analyses in entertainment industry history. Anthony Daniels was a classically trained theater actor who had never done film work when he was cast as C-3PO. He came to his first costume fitting with the reasonable expectation that playing a robot would be an interesting creative challenge. What he encountered was something closer to a wearable nightmare. The C-3PO costume consisted of 17 individual pieces of rigid golden fiberglass that were fitted and clamped onto Daniels one by one. He used the word gradually to describe the experience of putting it on, as in, he felt his humanity leaving him gradually with each piece that was attached. Vision was severely limited. Movement was restricted. The suit did not flex with his body because fiberglass does not flex. They filmed a short test sequence in the workshop. Daniel stumbled around crashing into things for 10 minutes. When the costume came off, the relief was so overwhelming it felt almost like surfacing from underwater. 10 minutes felt like considerably longer than 10 minutes. Then came Tunisia, where Daniel stood in a desert in a sealed fiberglass suit while the temperature climbed to 100 degrees. Sand, because sand finds every gap and crack in anything, worked its way into the costume and ground against his skin for hours after filming wrapped each day. He described the itching as something that defied ordinary language. The worst moment came during production of Return of the Jedi. A small creature character called Salacious Crumb was supposed to gnaw on C-3PO's eye in a scene, which required Daniels to lie horizontally inside the costume while the shot was set up. Flat on his back in a sealed suit, claustrophobia hit him without warning. He began screaming for the crew to get him out, immediately, right now, without any more delay. They removed his helmet as quickly as they could, but the experience left a mark. Daniels has said the panic attack gave him a genuine understanding of what people with serious phobias go through, an appreciation he perhaps could have done without acquiring. George Lucas founded Industrial Light and Magic, the visual effects company that would eventually become the gold standard of movie magic, specifically to create the effects for Star Wars. He established it, staffed it, and then flew from London, where the main production was shooting, to California to check on their progress. He needed 350 finished effects shots to complete the film. The release was locked for Memorial Day 1977, months away. When Lucas walked into the ILM facility and asked to see what they had completed so far, the answer was 3 shots. Not 300. 3. The team had been working, technically speaking, but they were working with experimental technology, encountering problems nobody had solutions for yet, and operating on a timeline that assumed things would go smoothly. Things had not gone smoothly. Fox executives learned about the catastrophic gap between what existed and what was needed, and they had a serious internal discussion about simply canceling Star Wars entirely. The movie was already over budget. Finishing it would require an additional $5 million and a level of effort that seemed almost physically impossible given the time frame. Cutting their losses and moving on was genuinely on the table. An executive at Fox named Alan Ladd Jr. had championed the film from the beginning and fought to keep it alive at this moment. He convinced the studio to authorize the additional budget but made one thing absolutely clear: the Memorial Day release date was non-negotiable. It would not move. From that point forward, ILM operated around the clock with crews working in rotating shifts, people sleeping in the facility when they had spare hours, everyone running on caffeine and the particular kind of energy that comes from knowing that failure is not a theoretical possibility. They delivered 347 shots in a matter of months. Some prints of the film that reached theaters were reportedly still slightly damp from the processing lab when they arrived. But they made it. In February of 1977, George Lucas screened an early cut of Star Wars for a small group of filmmakers and industry friends at his home. He wanted honest opinions from people he trusted. He absolutely got them. Director Brian De Palma, who was at that point a successful filmmaker and considered a peer and friend of Lucas's, watched the entire film in what Lucas hoped was fascinated engagement. When the lights came up, De Palma launched into a criticism that hit basically everything: the mystical force elements, which De Palma found embarrassing and confused, the pacing, the dialogue, the overall concept. Other people in the room laughed along. The mood was not kind. Lucas walked away from that screening genuinely shaken. These were not hostile critics hired to find problems. These were colleagues whose opinions he valued, people whose professional judgment he respected. If they were confused and dismissive, maybe the film really was a disaster. A few months later, in early May, Lucas held another screening at a theater in San Francisco. Right before the film began, he pulled aside his editor and told him quietly to prepare for the worst. Fox would almost certainly demand a complete re-edit once the audience's reaction made it clear what a mess they had on their hands. The audience did not have that reaction. They cheered loudly during the climactic space battle. They applauded at the ending. People sat in stunned, giddy silence during the moments that were supposed to feel enormous and then erupted when those moments delivered. Star Wars opened May 25, 1977. Its opening weekend earnings were extraordinary. By the end of that year, it had earned nearly $200 million in the United States alone. Worldwide it eventually crossed $775 million, a number that had no real precedent in film history at the time. De Palma's mockery of the Force, that element he found so foolish, has since become the spiritual backbone of what is now one of the highest-grossing entertainment franchises in human history. Kenny Baker was a performer who stood just under 4 feet tall, and George Lucas cast him to operate R2-D2 from the inside, physically controlling the droid's movements from within the shell of the costume during shots that required more nuance than a remote control could provide. In interviews conducted years later, Baker was refreshingly and completely honest about what the job was like. He said there were no highlights. He was put inside the droid, the lid was closed over him, and he worked. That was it. No profound creative moments. No sense of contributing to something historic. Just a man inside a metal shell in a hot desert, doing a job. The R2-D2 costume was built from aluminum, alloys, and fiberglass. During the Tunisia shoot, with temperatures reaching 100 degrees, Baker roasted inside it without ventilation. Sand, found its way into the control panels and caused constant technical failures. The remote control system that was supposed to move R2-D2 in wide shots was plagued by the same signal interference problems that had caused chaos on day one of filming, so for many scenes, crew members simply dragged the droid across the desert ground on skis while Baker sat inside and endured. He got stuck inside the costume on multiple occasions when technical problems prevented the lid from opening properly. He played R2-D2 across 6 films spanning nearly 30 years. He attended fan conventions and genuinely enjoyed meeting the people who loved the character. The one thing Baker did not enjoy about the experience was his co-star. Anthony Daniels, who played C-3PO, and Kenny Baker, who played R2-D2, had a relationship that was cordial almost exclusively in the professional sense. Baker described Daniels in interviews as the rudest man he had ever encountered. The two beloved droids who spent decades side by side on screen apparently could barely stand each other off it. Star Wars opened in May of 1977. By the time summer became fall and fall started turning toward the holiday shopping season, it was the biggest film anyone had ever seen, and children across the country desperately wanted Star Wars toys. Action figures. Ships. Anything with the logo on it. Kenner held the exclusive toy license. They also had a severe problem. Action figures in the 1970s required over a year of development and manufacturing time from concept to retail shelf. Star Wars had not existed a year ago. Kenner had absolutely nothing ready to sell for Christmas. Most companies in that situation accept the loss and wait until the following year. Kenner came up with a different idea that was either creative genius or complete audacity depending on how you look at it. They would sell the idea of the toys instead of the toys themselves. For $7.99, parents could purchase what Kenner called an early bird certificate package. Inside the box was a membership card, some stickers, a display stand, designed to hold 4 action figures that did not exist yet, and a certificate. The certificate was essentially an IOU. It promised that Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2 action figures would be mailed directly to your home sometime between February and June of 1978. Children opened these packages on Christmas morning and found a piece of paper telling them their toys were coming eventually. This should have caused a national parent uprising. It should have been a disaster that ended Kenner's relationship with the Star Wars license before it truly began. Instead, the boxes sold out. In New York and Chicago, the test markets where Kenner released them, 500,000 units disappeared immediately, and Kenner could not restock shelves fast enough. Children in 1977 were so thoroughly in love with Star Wars that they asked their parents for a cardboard promise and considered it a perfectly acceptable Christmas gift. The actual figures shipped in early 1978. Kenner had successfully invented the concept of pre-selling toys that did not exist yet, and they had done it by accident while trying to solve a production scheduling problem. The opening crawl of Star Wars, that text scrolling up into a field of stars before the action begins, is one of the most recognizable images in cinema. But it almost caused a genuine industry war, and George Lucas's response to the situation reveals something important about who he was as a filmmaker. The Directors Guild of America has rules about how directors must be credited in films. When Star Wars came out in 1977, Lucas had deliberately structured the opening to skip traditional credits entirely and drop the audience straight into the story. The DGA reviewed the film and determined this was acceptable because no individual person was credited at the beginning, which meant the director did not need to be either. Fine. No problem. When The Empire Strikes Back was released in 1980, directed by Irvin Kershner, the DGA took a different position. The Lucasfilm name appeared at the start of the film. The DGA now argued this constituted a personal credit for George Lucas, since it was his company. Because Lucas's name was effectively present at the beginning while Kershner's directing credit appeared only at the end, they claimed a violation of their rules. The fine issued to Lucasfilm was $250,000. They also demanded the film be pulled from theaters and recut to add Kershner's name to the beginning, a process that would have cost an additional $500,000 and disrupted the release of a film that was already in cinemas. Kershner himself received a separate fine for being the director of record on a non-compliant production. Lucas's response was swift and total. He paid Kershner's fine personally. He took the DGA to court. When they countered, he settled financially and then resigned from the Directors Guild, the Writers Guild, and the Motion Picture Association of America in one move. The practical consequence arrived immediately. Because Lucas was no longer a DGA member, he could not hire any DGA member directors for Return of the Jedi. Steven Spielberg, his first choice, was unavailable to him under those rules. Lucas ended up with Richard Marquand. The entire chain of events traced back to a stylistic decision about where to put the credits. Lucas chose his creative principles over his industry relationships and never went back. Carrie Fisher grew up watching her parents, the actress Debbie Reynolds and the singer Eddie Fisher, navigate fame and then watch it slowly fade. She saw what celebrity did to people she loved, the way it built them up and then withdrew, the particular kind of grief that came with being adored by the public and then gradually forgotten. She made a decision early that she wanted no part of that world. When she auditioned for Star Wars at 19, she had no meaningful sense that the film would matter. It was a job. An opportunity. Something interesting to do. In a 2008 interview, Fisher said something that stopped people cold. If she had known Princess Leia would make her as famous as it did, she would not have taken the role. Not because the role was wrong for her or beneath her, she was warm about the character and ultimately made peace with the legacy, but because fame itself was something she had watched destroy people she loved, and she did not want that experience for herself. She knew from watching her parents that celebrity could hollow a person out, and she spent years quietly waiting for the public's interest in her to diminish the way it had diminished for them. It did not diminish. Princess Leia became something larger than a film character. The image became a symbol, a shorthand for strength and resistance and a particular kind of intelligence combined with courage. Generation after generation of people grew up with that character, and generation after generation found their way to Carrie Fisher because of it. Fisher spent decades making an uneasy truce with her own fame. She turned it into material for her books and her stand-up. She talked about it with a honesty that very few public figures ever manage. She made it funny sometimes, and sometimes she just made it honest. But she never stopped being Princess Leia in the public imagination, no matter what else she did. When she passed away in December of 2016, every obituary, every tribute, every news segment led with the same image. Not the writer. Not the mental health advocate. Not the witty, sharp, brutally honest human being she had built herself into over 40 years. Princess Leia. The thing she said she never would have chosen. She ran from that specific kind of fame her whole life. It was waiting at the finish line. And there you have it, 15 facts about a movie that had every possible reason to fail and somehow became the defining entertainment franchise of the last 50 years. What makes Star Wars remarkable is not just that it worked. It is how close it came, on so many separate occasions and in so many different ways, to not working at all. A director losing his hair from stress. A villain who sounded like a farmer. Effects teams finishing 3 shots when they needed 350. A studio breaking federal law just to fill enough theater screens. A toy company selling empty boxes. An actor inside a golden suit having a panic attack. Another actor inside a metal dome who genuinely hated every second. All of it combining somehow to produce something that people are still watching, still debating, still arguing about, and still loving nearly 50 years later. Which of these facts hit you hardest? Drop your answer in the comments, I genuinely want to know. If you got all the way to number 1, thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, and I will see you in the next video.